Welcome to the Belmont-Paul Women's Equality National Monument. It's here in this space, in the main hall of the monument, where we introduce our visitors to the National Women's Party, a radical, innovative organization that fought for women's rights throughout the 20th century. First with the 19th Amendment, which granted women the right to vote in 1920, and then later with the Equal Rights Amendment, which many don't realize was first introduced into Congress in 1923 and is still an ongoing fight today. It has never been passed. Here in this space, you can see pictures of women in prison uniforms because the National Women's Party was the first organization ever to picket the White House, and its members went to prison and went on hunger strikes and were force-fed. So very dramatic stories that we talk about and tell, and we're a part of this legacy of women. As you walk through this house, as you see what tactics and strategies they engaged in to fight for the right to vote, I hope you'll also think about how those same tactics and strategies are continued to be used today in not just the fight for women, but also for fights like voting rights and equal pay, issues that impact women every day, which are ongoing in today's society. We're standing in the Origins Gallery, where we share stories about the early fight for the right to vote, particularly looking at the 19th Amendment and the people who were involved at that time. We have things like Susan B. Anthony's desk and Elizabeth Cady Stanton's chair. We also talk a lot about the men who were supportive of the movement, including, most importantly here, Frederick Douglass, who was an abolitionist, but also a great believer in women's rights and women's political involvement. In this particular gallery, we're really focusing on sort of some of the early people who inspired Alice Paul and inspired the efforts of the NWP, but also starting to dig into the large parades and pageantry and those big tactics and strategies that took the 19th Amendment from really being stalled around 1912 to its success in 1920. We talk about the types of costumes and the types of banners that they used. The Mr. President, What Will You Do for Women's Suffrage banner, which is an iconic piece in our collection, is in this gallery, as well as the Votes for Women sashes and then capes and hats and things that they wore in big parades and big demonstrations. This is one of those galleries that leads into our discussion of the tactics and strategies of the NWP, which we will get into later in the tour. But a lot of the richness of our collection can be seen in this space. By the end of 1917, hundreds of women had been picketing the White House for almost a year. By the time we got to December, many women had been arrested and were put in prisons, in the district prison here in Washington, D.C., or in Lorton Prison out in Virginia. Women went on hunger strikes and were forced fed, and at that point, they were really struggling to keep up morale and also to show women that the sacrifices that they were making were really working toward the greater goal of women's right to vote and ultimately women's equality. Alice Paul commissioned this jail door pin to show women that the sacrifices that they were making were not in vain. The jail door pin is in the shape of a tiny jail door cell, and these were presented to the National Women's Party members who had been to prison in a ceremony in Washington, D.C. in December of 1917. For many years, women would continue to wear these pins as a badge of honor throughout their fights for women's equality, no matter where those fights may have taken them. And today, many families continue to have these very rare pins in their own family collections. They're cherished objects. Belmont-Paul is fortunate to have one of the pins, which was donated by a woman named Betsy Graves Renault. And then also here in DC, other jail door pins, there are 3 other jail door pins at the Smithsonian. One of the most important tactics and strategies that the National Women's Party employed was the use of branding and messaging and color on a lot of the more public pieces that they put out there. So for things like demonstrations and parades and pickets, they would hold these wonderful banners that were often in the suffrage colors of purple, white, and gold. These were the National Woman's Party colors. And they would have slogans like this one that said, "Mr. President, what will you do for women's suffrage?" Another example is, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?" or something similar. These messages that would get right to the heart of what they were fighting for at that time. The purple, white, and gold, as I said, were the standard colors for the National Woman's Party, and they used them in everything that they did. So all of their sashes, all of their banners, all of their costumes were always made in purple, white, or gold, or a mixture of all. The purple stood for the glory of womanhood, the white for purity in home and politics, and the gold for the crown of victory, although even that meaning would change depending on the audience that they were talking to. As you wander through the galleries, you should also notice that a lot of the textiles that we showcase were handmade. So even on this bonnet here, which they would have worn in a parade, you can see the hand stitching on it. And these were made in mass for hundreds of women to be able to wear during a big demonstration. And the capes likewise, the purple and the gold you'll see right here. So this was just another way, and a very impactful way, that they got their message out there, that they were able to maintain cohesiveness so that people would know when they were looking at something that came from the National Woman's Party, and and the best way for them to get their messaging out there. We're standing in the Tactics and Strategies Gallery, where we talk a lot about the innovative methods that the National Woman's Party employed in order to fight for the right to vote and later the Equal Rights Amendment. One of their biggest policies was to hold the political party in power, responsible for the future of women. So at that time, between 1913 and 1920, it was the Democratic Party led by President Woodrow Wilson. Throughout their campaigns from 1913 to 1916, the National Woman's Party actively worked against the Democratic Party. It was a method that was considered very controversial at the time, but they actively worked against these candidates and tried to have them lose in their elections. They tried to get other candidates elected that were more supportive of women's right to vote, and they lobbied against President Wilson. By the end of 1916, frustrated by their sort of lack of progress using this method, they decided to try something new. So in January of 1917, they began picketing the White House. They were the first group ever to picket the White House that we are aware of. And so what was great about this was that their headquarters was located on Lafayette Square, just steps from the president's doorstep. So they could literally walk out their door, walk down the street, and be at the gates of the White House within 5 minutes. They would hold banners like the ones that we've talked about before. "Mr. President, what will you do for women's suffrage? Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?" And they would stand there from sunup to sundown every day holding these banners, and they were called silent sentinels because they wouldn't speak a word. Polite crowds would sort of watch them, marvel at what they were doing. President Wilson would tip his hat and offer them coffee, and they would continue to stand there without saying a word. And at first, all of this was fine. But in April of 1917, the United States entered World War I, and the attitude toward this act changed. It became more treasonous, less patriotic. They were seen as fighting against a system that was working toward democracy. But their argument was that the president was working toward democracy abroad and not here in the United States. In 1920, after women won the right to vote with the ratification and passage of the 19th Amendment, the National Woman's Party began to analyze all the ways in which women remained unequal under the eyes of the law. In 1923, they began by introducing the Equal Rights Amendment. Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Today, the ERA remains unpassed. There are many arguments both for and against the Equal Rights Amendment, but it has received renewed interest in recent years. It came close to passage in the early 1980s, but fell just 3 states short, and there are renewed efforts toward its passage and renewed interest in what it would mean for women today. Full equality under the law continues to be a priority for many women's rights organizations. And the National Women's Party continues to share information about these efforts as they go forward. In addition to being the headquarters of the National Woman's Party, this site was also a residence for many of its members. NWP members could stay here for about $6 a night and rent a room. And oftentimes members would come and go, but Alice Paul herself lived here between 1929 and 1972. And in fact, this was her bedroom. But this is the site and the spot where we talk about the fact that this was a residence and this was a place for people for members to come together, to learn how to lobby, to gain experience from other members, and to learn of their own personal struggles with inequality. Alice Paul's desk sits right behind us, and we certainly use that as a way to talk about her focus and her intense focus on equal rights and equality for women. The National Woman's Party was one of the only organizations to boast having an official cartoonist. A woman named Nina Allender drew cartoons to propel the movement and to really showcase what they were doing between 1913 and 1927. Allender's work is unique in that at a time when there were so many negative images of women, either in cartoon or photograph or otherwise, Allender created a new type of suffragist who was not only feminine, but also very intelligent and empowered and ready to jump into any political cause. Her work impacted the people around her, and it responded to the news of the week and whatever was happening at that time. So what you see in her cartoons are common symbols that you would see in a lot of political cartoons, the donkey and the elephant, or Uncle Sam. She used President Wilson quite often in a lot of her work, and she would often hearken back to the legacy of the movement using figures like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, or even Abraham Lincoln. Her work continues to be very impactful on our visitors today as it continues to resonate with current issues within the movement, and is one of the most unique portions of our collection. As we approach the 2020 centennial of the passage of the 19th Amendment, we have an exhibit at Belmont-Paul which talks about the passage of the amendment. In June of 1919, Congress passed the amendment and sent it to the states for ratification. Behind me, you can see a map of the order in which states ratified the amendment. And so over the next 18 months, National Woman's Party members scoured the country working toward the ratification of the 19th Amendment. One fun thing in this gallery is the Nina Allender cartoon here, which showcases a picture of the ratification banner. This particular banner was created specifically to mark the states that ratified the amendment. So for every state that ratified suffrage, the NWP members would sew a star on. And finally, when Tennessee became that 36th and final state, they sewed the final star on, and you can see in this picture behind me, Alice Paul unfurling it over the balcony at headquarters. This is a big mystery in our collection. We don't know actually what happened to this banner. It has disappeared. So there are ongoing efforts to try and find it. The only piece that remains from the banner is this star of feathers behind me. Hawaii was not yet a state, they were a territory, but a group of women wanted to show their support for the efforts toward the 19th Amendment, so they sent this star of feathers to the NWP. So it was ultimately separated from the original banner, but remains the only piece that we have left. So we hope you'll join us in trying to find the ratification banner, and hopefully one day it will find its way home to the Belmont-Paul Women's Equality National Monument.